good evening to you and welcome to today's edition of Politics 101. I'm David Hines. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Guyana CARICOM dynamics in the wake of the 2020 election. As you know, the CARICOM was deeply involved in Guyana's 2020 election, of course, not for the first time. In 1997, after the results were announced and there was an impasse, CARICOM sent in a team, what they called the team of wise men then, to broker a post-election agreement between the two major political parties. That led to the signing of the Ord-Munston Accord. Later on, CARICOM sent in someone to do, Mr. Ulrich Cross, to do a forensic audit of the polls. So when CARICOM was called in, as the impasse developed after the 2020 election, it was no surprise to many observers, since, as I said, it was not the first time. However, last year, 2020, the role of CARICOM changed from that of an honest broker to what most people would describe as becoming deeply entangled in the election, and in a sense, taking one side over the other. Certainly, that is the view coming from the perspective of the coalition and their support. Since then, of course, there has been a big debate on CARICOM and the role of CARICOM in Guyana. Questions have been raised for the very first time as to whether Guyana should opt out of CARICOM. Certainly, the Caribbean Court of Justice, which also played a major role in the outcome of the 2020 election. There have been a lot of talk about whether Guyana should opt out of the CCA. Almost 1 year after that election, we want to revisit that question. Of course, over the weekend, we celebrated the 42nd anniversary, certainly 48th anniversary of CARICOM, which came into being in 1973 with the signing of the Treaty of Chaguaramas. So we thought it would be an opportune time to look at that subject, the Guyana CARICOM dynamics after the 2020 election. I did not say the relations, because we don't know where relations are. But what we saw was CARICOM playing a big role in the election. And after the PPP was installed, we saw them going against the CARICOM spirit. Their attitude to Haitians coming to Guyana. Although Haiti is a part of CARICOM and, of course, is entitled, the nationals of that country are entitled to the same kind of free movement as other CARICOM nationals. We saw recently the Guyana government saying that the Haitians would need a visa to come to Guyana. We saw the exchange between the Guyana government and Prime Minister Rowley of Trinidad and Tobago over the vaccine and the refusal
Please help keep Politics 101 on social media and broadcast television. If you are in North America, please donate via Cash App or PayPal.
If you are in Guyana and the Caribbean and don't have access to Cash App and PayPal, Email your pledge to dhines6106@aol.com and we will direct you how to get your donation to us. Thank you in advance for your donation.
So we're not in the realm of supposition anymore. We know for a fact that people have voted. We know for a fact that people who are not in the jurisdiction would have voted. We know for a fact that there are 47 ballot boxes without documents. These are facts that are incontrovertible. It's not up for debate. We're not unsure about these things. And so I think the only reason that we ended up at a petition was that the court recognized that while everybody in fact recognized that whilst we have discovered these anomalies and irregularities, the mechanism through which we could address them is an elections petition. So it does not negate the fact of the findings. It does not negate the fact that the PPP has not been able to refute these allegations. And so even with this throwing out of the petition, temporarily I would say, because I believe we have very, very strong prospects in terms of appeal, the PPP has not convinced anybody that they have not gotten there by illegitimate means. Because the very mechanism through which we were going to receive, as it were, the imprimatur of the court to say that these actions were illegal, it is the same mechanism through which the PPP could have acquitted themselves of these charges. And so these facts remain, and this is what I want to encourage our people. Don't be disheartened by this. The facts are the facts.
Please help keep Politics 101 on social media and broadcast television. If you are in North America, please donate via Cash App or PayPal.
If you are in Guyana and the Caribbean and don't have access to Cash App and PayPal, email your pledge to dhines6106@aol.com and we will direct you how to get your donation to us. Thank you in advance for your donation.
And welcome back. I was, before the break, introducing my guest, Winston Jordan, who is the former finance minister in the coalition government, and so was there, so to speak, during the impasse last year. And he broached the subject on a program on CAMS TV a few weeks ago, speculating or giving us some insights, rather giving us some insights on what might have instigated, what might have propelled CARICOM to take the position to take. And young Keith Austin Jr. appearing on Politics 101 for the first time. We would like to apologize for the absence of Manzo Disease, who is under the weather, not feeling well, and Mr. Ramon Gaskin, who is having some technical difficulties. Gentlemen, welcome to Politics 101.
Good day, Dr. Haynes.
Good. Winston, let me start with you. You are taking the position that there were internal difficulties, but as far as regime change was concerned that you didn't think that it was the only factor. Would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, oh well, good night, David. Good night, young Austin, and good night to your viewers. Well, the topic seems to be stressing on CARICOM, and rightly so, because it's the 40th birthday of CARICOM. You know, the new normal is 50 rather than 40. Remember, life used to begin at 40, but now I'm hearing that life really begins at 50. You know, and so if that is the case, then CARICOM is 2 years short of beginning its life, so to speak. Not born, but perhaps reborn. And I think it's a good time to consider the rebirth of CARICOM, because I think in many ways CARICOM has regressed from its formative years, from the halcyon days of the greats, of the Forbes Burnham and the Michael Manley and the Eric Williams and Barrow, not forgetting people like Bradshaw and Pinling and Sir John Compton. You know, those were big men. Big men. They had a lot in common. One thing they had in common was Federation come West Indian come Caribbean unity, a Caribbean spirit, and they worked over time to ensure that that spirit of togetherness realized some benefits. They recognized a lot of difficulties, but they were prepared, especially Forbes Burnham. I mean, as I keep saying, Forbes can be knocked for many things, but in many other things, he expressed a vision and he portrayed a vision that is second to none, that is still relevant today. And so when you see the achievements of the early CARICOM, you know, like bringing Cuba out to the coal, right? Taking that stance of bringing Cuba out to the coal, bringing China into the fold. You know, I mean, people don't recognize what people like Forbes Burnham and so on did for China in 1972. You know, the stance that we had with foreign policy. I mean, that was one of our hallmarks in CARICOM. The togetherness, the oneness that we portrayed in foreign policy and so on. And there were many other developments in the early formative years. You know, people forgetting, for example, but while we didn't have a common currency in CARICOM, we operated what you call in those days a traveler's check. You know, that was backed by Trinidad. You know, we also had a line of credit, $100 million U.S. trade credit. Now, all of these facilities, I don't think many of your viewers are aware of the massive achievements in the early days of CARICOM. But unfortunately, all of those have gone or no longer in vogue or don't no longer occupy the prime space that they used to occupy. And it seems as if, especially with events like the removal of the bananas subsidy in Europe, the removal of the sugar subsidy, you know, the blows that the OECS have been taking, and even Barbados and so on, have been taken from Europe in relation to offshore accounts and so on. All of this have taken a toll on territories. Even the lack of interest, for example, of America in her backyard territories, you know, thus allowing people like China and Russia and non-conventional donors like India to come in and fill voids. All of that have left these small countries floundering. And therefore, that unity, instead of moving forward and deeper into unity, I think the cat has been set among the pigeons. And we are now scattered, so to speak, with a lot of that insularity that was always boiling on the surface, that has reared its ugly head more and more in recent times. And you have also had a scenario where, as I said, each one of these territories fighting for survival, the blows that tourism and so on is taking, each is fighting for survival. And therefore, whenever a chance opportunity shows itself, they tend to grab it. None more so, for example, when Chavez introduced the Petro-Carib. In the blink of an eye, many of the territories more or less abandoned Trinidad and went towards the gift that was being borne by Chavez at that time. And of course, as you see today, when that Petro-Carib is no longer of the kind that was known in the early days, these territories are also looking for new godfathers and so forth. And in many respects, that new godfather is Guyana, with its oil, with its promises of bountiful returns and so forth. And therefore, I think what a number of the CARICOM territories are really doing and lining up is that they are lining up behind who they consider to be a benefactor that they can deal with, so to speak. They're not going to, this is not the days of the Morris Bishop and so on, where you have certain people in CARICOM are left wing, certain are middle of the road, certain are ultra right wing, and so on. I think generally you can say, if you forget all the isms, this is a question of survival, and therefore people are going to line up where they see an opportunity is presenting itself. And I think in the elections of 2020, people saw where the wind was blowing vis-a-vis with America, with Britain, with Canada, with the European Union, and so forth. And they weren't about to buck any horse in the mold of a Morris Bishop or a Castro or so on. Given the state of their economies and so forth, I don't think they were prepared for that fight. I don't think they were prepared for any such opposition. And to my mind, they just went where the waves were flowing. And that is where, unfortunately, we as the government didn't read the tea leaves correctly. And people we thought were friends, essentially, we found out later on that while they want to be still friends, they were prepared to put their country's interests way to the front, so to speak. And I know you mentioned the CAM story, and I did reference a certain scenario in the CAM story with the Barbados Prime Minister. And when she first came on the scene, she made a lot of waves. She continues to make waves, but she made a lot of waves then. And there was an initial, I wouldn't want to say confrontation, but there was an initial standing up to America. And I think very early she recognized that that kind of behavior and attitude and so on wouldn't get very far with the Trump administration. I mean, you if you remember the incident in Jamaica, where Jamaica and certain other people were invited for meetings with high-level U.S. officials. They were invited, I think, with meetings with Trump and so forth. And Barbados was excluded, and Barbados found itself in economic troubles. It went to IDB, it went to World Bank, and they had a lot of pushback. Barbados had a lot of pushback where that was concerned in terms of getting loans from these institutions. So I think reality politics soon stepped in, and when that happened, Barbados was rewarded. Where there were obstacles in terms of getting loans from the IDB and the World Bank, those obstacles were removed, and they eventually got some assistance, and I think Mia became the darling of some of the international institutions subsequently, writing letters, getting good responses, and so on. So I think what I'm trying to say, all the radical politics and so on and so forth, I think has gone. Number two, what is being suggested here, look, we are friends and so forth, but to a point. Our interest now is what is in vogue, what is going to supersede all our... We're still friends, I mean, you can't say Rowley and Granger are not friends, but when you look at the practicality of the politics and so forth, Look, we're friends, boy, but I mean, look, you guys try with your stuff over there. We have to try with our own. And with that quiet kind of diplomacy, Trinidad is literally taking over Guyana. No big set of waves, but every time you wake up, Trinidad is owning something. Trinidad contractors are all over the place in this country. Trinidad has the largest stake in our banking system, the largest individual bank. And now they have another one named First Citizens Bank that is awaiting approval from the Bank of Guyana and the government of Guyana so that they can take over Scotiabank. And if that were to happen, together they will own, I believe they will own more than 50% of the banking system in this country. So, you know, they have two of the biggest supermarkets in this country. So Trinidad is quietly taking over Guyana. So the little country terms that took place between Rowley and officials from this administration, those will die quickly. I mean, the bigger stakes are there, and they're not about to disrupt. They're not about to disrupt those. So I leave that there, and we can press on this further. Give young Austin a little.
Yes, thank you very much, Winston, and welcome to the audience. I see that you're gathering. And after that introduction by Mr. Jordan, you understand why we invited him, why we're having this discussion. Because he has made a very, very, very poignant observation. And that is the CARICOM of today. Is not the CARICOM of yesterday. The CARICOM of yesterday was based on a deeply felt historical and cultural bond that whatever happens in the realm of economics and politics, as Black Stallions came on the same ship from the same place, and so therefore we should hold together come what may. But you've seen the transition to a regional integration of survival in an era when the Caribbean countries continue to struggle even more than they did decades ago economically. At the end of the day, it is the insular country over the integration movement that seems to have taken over. And it is in that context that the CARICOM's strange moves during the elections should be interpreted. Mr. Austin, welcome to Politics 101. I guess you heard from the elders. Do you share the same perspective that Winston Jordan introduced? I think you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Hines. Good night to Mr. Jordan, former Minister of Finance, and to the viewers who are taking time to have some civic education in these very difficult times. Now, I want to say from the inception that I'll be full disclosure. I'm for CARICOM. I'm not a CARI skeptic. I do believe that the beautiful idea that began with CARIFTA in 1968 and then 73, with the conference and the various heads of state meeting and displaying global statesmanship. I mean, as a historian, every time I read the speeches and I go back to that period, I mean, you get goosebumps, you know, having those leaders come onto the world stage and essentially say that we're going to talk to the world with one voice was a beautiful thing. When one looks at the successes of CXC and the weight it carries, when you look at the cooperation in health and the Caribbean cooperation in health that led to the elimination of polio within the region, one can say that CARICOM remains a beautiful idea. From the inception, the concept was that these small nations, after independence, cannot have, you know, their singular voice on the world stage, as some would call them, banana republic. So you come together in a union and you speak with one voice. I do believe it's a beautiful idea. The Grand Anse Declaration of 1989, also a beautiful idea. The 2001 revision of the Treaty of Chaguaramas, in which there was a commitment to CSME, even though it was supposed to come on board in 2015 and it never came. I still remain hopeful that the idea of CARICOM will come to its fullest fruition. I mean, if one looks at regional integration in other parts of the world, whether it's the AU, the African Union, whether it's ASEAN with the Asian nations, whether you're talking about NAFTA, which has been obviously discarded, if you're talking about the EU, they're teaching problems and you're not going to get the kinds of promises contained within the CSME just like that. You don't have to be a regional integration expert to know that the kinds of lofty ideas articulated, expressed with the concept of the CSME would require some kind of supernatural structure for enforcement. You're basically articulating some serious ideas that we call for, as Mr. Jordan mentioned, the issue of survival. And when one survivor is threatened, and there's nothing propelling you to stick to those values, then you're going to run into trouble. I think we're going to talk, we're going to express lofty ideals, we're going to deliver grandiose speeches, but when it comes down to the on-the-ground issues, we're going to, at some point, have to admit that the idea of CSME and CARICOM reaching its apogee in terms of its idea, we are going to have to talk about something supernatural. For example, with the European Union, you have the European Commission, the European Parliament. That is how they enforce those kinds of ideas. Every time this kind of discussion comes up, Dr. Hines, I often like to reference the case of Shanique Myrie in 2002. For those who don't know, Shanique Myrie, a Jamaican woman who traveled to Barbados and was searched and detained and was rejected. She took the Barbados government to court, to the CCJ, one of its first major freedom of movement cases. And if you look at the arguments presented in that case by Barbados, they essentially said in that case that the commitments made in Article 45 of the revised treaty and the 2007 conference in which the leaders committed to freedom of movement, Barbados said to the court that those are not legally binding things in their domestic law. Barbados essentially eschewed those serious commitments. And I believe the Shanique Myrie case is a case that demonstrates the kinds of problems you're going to get when it comes to this talk of freedom of movement. Separate and apart from the skills nationals arrangement, in which you can apply and get your work permit and so on before. But we say freedom of movement, come and stay for 6 months and you can roam freely in the country. But I must remind persons, as a proponent of CARICOM, I was always concerned with the kind of language that was placed within the kind of documentation surrounding this freedom of movement thing. If you look at it, it says that you're free to move around, but there are two stipulations. You must not be part of what the leaders call undesirable people, and you must not be a charge onto the purse of the country. Now, those kinds of provisions, that kind of language gives regional governments vast powers and very capricious and arbitrary decision-making options where they can decide, oh, you're not desirable, or you will be a charge on our purse, and we can reject you. So as a supporter of CARICOM, when I paid attention to the kind of language that was contained within the discussion around freedom of movement, I knew that we were heading for trouble, because it sounds good, we talk the good talk, but then when the nationals show up at your airport and you have political considerations that you may have insularity and nationalism coming into play, you have these two provisions within the commitment that allow you to essentially gives you leverage to act in a very fleeting and capricious manner. It says that if the people are undesirable to you, you can reject them. And if they are a charge in your purse, very broad language that persons are allowed to exploit. So in a nutshell, I want to say, one, I'm a supporter of CARICOM, and two, I accept that we have serious challenges. And I believe that at some point, if we're going to realize these kinds of lofty ideas we keep articulating at the conferences and the discussion fora, I think at some point, we're going to have to talk about some supranational arrangement to enforce these decisions.
All right, good. And your point is well taken. We're not hearing you, Winston. You're
not hearing me?
We're hearing you now.
Oh, you hearing me now? Right.
Yeah.
I just want a quick response to he raised some very interesting points, and I don't want them to be missed as such, if you will allow me.
Yes, go right ahead.
Right, okay. Right. So I don't want to get any impression that I'm anti-CARICOM. I'm like young Austin. I do believe that CARICOM is necessary. It's probably more necessary now than ever before. Certainly necessary since the days of the Federation, and even the little eights and all this, little six and eights and whatever the case may be. Yes. So I'm not anti-CARICOM. I'm full for CARICOM. What I'm saying is that CARICOM in its present construct either will not survive or will not be of much benefit to its constituent members. Okay, as I said, we have retrogressed, was I think my word, we have retrogressed from the formative years, from the ideals, the visions, the achievements, and so forth, into today, where if you were to do a survey, even in Guyana, that was heavily pro-CARICOM. If you were to do a survey today, you might be shocked to find out the number of no's and the number of people who are actually asking for us to pull out of CARICOM. I'm not one of them, but I'm saying I think they're fed up with the non-achievements of CARICOM. They like the ideals and so forth, but I don't think they can survive on ideals. The second point is that CARICOM has shown in its 48 years that perhaps with the exception of Guyana, no one else is prepared to cede any sovereignty or whatever you want to call it, so to speak. So the idea of a supranational entity that has been talked about and responsible for implementing decision, all these things, and no, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. You have technically a supranational organization in the CCJ, right? Because they interpret and they lay down the rules and so on. And already the CCJ is in hot water. Frondel Stewart had said, had he won the elections, he was out, Barbados was out to the CCJ. And I believe that word coalition to win, that the issue of the CCJ will be raised highly, because I think a lot of people took offense with the CCJ's action in relation to our constitution, that suggested that the appeal court had the final say, but that they had some hidden means of undoing that or reinterpreting that and so on. I don't think too many people are going to be interested in somebody, whether they were the Privy Council or whether the CCJ, but certainly outside of the domain of the country, sitting down there and making decisions for people who are increasingly, as you said, becoming insular and nationalist. So the issue of the supranational is out. I believe that perhaps we may take some study of OECS. Initially I didn't buy into subgroupings in the larger grouping, because to me that was essentially defeating the purpose. But maybe that is something to be looked at, because the achievements of OECS in such a short space of time, right, is a lesson to the wider CARICOM. But those OECS are more or less of about the same size, both in terms of geography, number of people, economy, and so on. And look what they have already: a common currency, a common central bank, right? No passport, I think, because I think you could walk into each one of them with ID cards. They have so much more that CARICOM was able to achieve, essentially. So perhaps we may wish to look at that and maybe have more subgroupings with more like-minded members in the overall thing called CARICOM. and have that for the time being, instead of having lofty, unimplementable ideas of common market and single economy and all these things that will go nowhere, quite frankly. You got members within CARICOM who are not members of the single market. Do you know that Guyana was the 8th country to impose visa on Haiti? They're not the first country. They're the 8th country in CARICOM to impose visas on Haiti, a country that struck the first blow for freedom in this entire hemisphere. And this is the way we are treating those people. We don't want them. Maybe if they had the skins of our good friends in Venezuela or in Cuba or so on, maybe yes. And we have shown that because we haven't treated Venezuelans and Cubans the way how we treat Haitians. We treat Haitians like as if they were pariahs. You know, we don't want them, so to speak. We don't want people who look like us. Okay? And whether it's a bench in Trinidad or a bench in Barbados or wherever else these Guyanese went or whoever else, we already show. We don't like people that look like us, so to speak. So this whole business of CARICOM and Jamaica, who exited the Federation force, they, a couple of years ago, actually undertook a study of this whole CARICOM and their whole position in it and so forth. And while I believe the present government has indicated they'll stay in CARICOM, they're going to be continuing to push either the CARICOM reforms in a radical way, or they will push themselves out. And I think this is where the discussion needs to go in a very substantive and substantial manner. The CARICOM that we have today is not working. Lofty speeches, as you continue to have in this last heads of government meeting and so forth, lofty speeches that are not backed by actionable programs and implemented will only get our people more and more frustrated, so to speak. So that is the little intervention I wanted to get over before I forgot.
Yes, and thanks for that, because I myself want to say that I am very much pro CARICOM. I could not imagine the Caribbean without CARICOM, for all its pains, for all its acts of omissions. I cannot imagine a Caribbean without CARICOM. However, if you look at the experience of regional integration, starting in '58 with the Federation, coming right through to the present, we've always have these stitches and these moments, sometimes extended moments, when it didn't work at all. I mean, after the Grenadian Revolution, the CARICOM leaders didn't meet for a long time. I mean, they were divided over the Grenadian Revolution. They were divided over America landing troops in Grenada. And it certainly caused difficulty. And Winston, the point about OECS is well taken. What is not well known is that the OECS took over architecture that was set in place by the Federation and ran with it. They cut the pieces from the Federation, took the plans of the Federation and ran with it. And that is why, along with the demographic factors that you mentioned, and the fact that in the Eastern Caribbean, they don't have a question of ethnicity there at all. That's a very important factor. And so that is a study as to how integration can succeed in our parts. I'm coming back to you, Mr. Austin. What do you think accounted for CARICOM's change in strategy towards Guyana? Guyana has always been politically an issue within CARICOM. And for a long time, CARICOM took a neutral position. So much so that the PPP always accused CARICOM of taking a racial position vis-a-vis Guyana when the PNC was in office. In fact, the PPP government prior to 2015 wanted to go into a sub-regional grouping with Trinidad under Pandey, right, and Suriname under an Indian-led government. What do you think in the face of all of that? In the face of a PPP hostility to CARICOM, went back to the Federation. Remember, Guyana was not part of the Federation because Dr. Jagan argued that Indians would become a minority in the West Indian Federation. And so, what accounted for a party that is anti-CARICOM, CARICOM in effect embracing the party over a party that has traditionally been pro-CARICOM? What do you think accounted for that?
Right. Thanks for that question, Dr. Hines. Before I get to that, I just want to mention 2 points. I wouldn't want to leave here for anybody to think that I'm an ultra-idealist. I agree with the kind of realism being expressed by Mr. Jordan. Yes, I talk about a supernatural entity, but I say that in the context of understanding this. All the kind of ideals we're advancing will only be realized if you have a supranational body, and that is not going to happen. If you look at the EU, I can't see us having those kind of structures here. So I'm saying you either revisit the strategy and stop all of this talk, or you make a decision on the supranational thing, which is not going to happen, as Mr. Jordan indicated. And secondly, the CCJ remains the litmus test, the barometer for us to see what we're willing to accept. I remember we must be reminded that the CCJ has 2 functions, dual functions: one, to interpret the treaty, and secondly, as the last court of jurisdiction. And some places like Trinidad, they have said, not us, you're not going to make the final decision on this. So that alone tells you the general attitude is not an attitude which suggests that all of this talk about CSME is going to happen. So I just want to clear those 2 things.
It's only 4 countries. It is the court of last resort. It's only Guyana, Barbados, Belize, and Dominica. All the others, it is only the court of first resort. And given what has happened recently, under DLP government, Barbados is likely to bolt. Under a PNC-led government, Guyana could bolt. We could see the breakup of the CCJ given developments vis-a-vis the Myrie case and CARICOM's involvement in the elections in Guyana. I made the observation on the program this morning that if you were to run a serious study in Guyana, what you are going to have is an Indian constituency under the PPP, which has always seen CARICOM as outsiders. And the African community embraced CARICOM, but given what happened recently, now are very anti-CARICOM. Guyana could be the worst anti-CARICOM place in the region, moving from what was perhaps the most hospitable place to regional integration. I mean, the secretariat is here. You never heard that Guyana got any bench keeping out anybody, and so on and so forth. In fact, my colleagues in the Caribbean would say, Lord, they wish it were Guyanese, the way in which we kind of dealt with regional integration. That has all now changed. But anyhow, back to the question, why, and I'm repeating the question, but some of the audience is asking me to, why you have 2 parties in Guyana, one that has always been hostile to CARICOM, one that has always been most hospitable to CARICOM. And CARICOM intervened on the side of the one that has been most hostile. In a sense, I'm paraphrasing, through the one that was most hospitable to them under the bus.
And my response to that question would be, I mean, this would be very unacademic, anecdotally speaking, in my estimation, that once Guyana would have discovered that oil, I've argued this publicly, that the dynamics have obviously changed. What happens here is no longer quite events. What happens here draws the attention of very powerful forces in world capitals. And in that kind of context, CARICOM cannot escape the kinds of pressures exerted here. It's not a case anymore where countries would want to, I mean, it happens all around the world. When countries have their interests and they want to get their interests realized in a country, they don't stick with the country, they go to the regional bodies. I mean, if you look at the military coup in Myanmar, the military junta, and how ASEAN responded. I mean, you go to the AU. People know the power of regional bodies. I mean, that's pretty basic. So whatever lobbying efforts, whatever financial efforts, whatever geopolitical interests are exerted on us, it goes through CARICOM. That's number one. In my estimation, why the dynamics have changed between Guyana and CARICOM. Secondly, in my estimation, I think with our last elections, CARICOM, I cannot see a case where CARICOM was operating in a vacuum without phones ringing in those capitals and persons making contact and saying, this is what we expect to see happen. I doubt it. In this world of powerful interest and decision making, it would be naive to think that a political upheaval is occurring in the country that contains the most important energy source in the world. And whatever political outcomes happen there will have an effect on that very important commodity. It's naive to think that Washington or Brussels, they're not on the phone, even if not on the phone, through their informal contacts, making some moves to say, this is what we expect to see happen. So that's my second observation. I believe, without clear evidence, but going on logics and going on what obtains in the world and what happens with these kinds of events, obviously I think the CARICOM leaders were, if not sent clear signals that, look, this is what we want to see. And we have to remember, this occurred during the time of a pandemic, when the world economy was contracting and when nations began to keep in their monies and when small islands were in definite trouble, fiscal trouble. You had major difficulties with the entire lockdown process. So CARICOM nations had to make a decision. Is this a time to go against the big powers? And if we do, how would we function in government after that? Is it a time to be revolutionary and stand up and say, look, we expect you to solve your problems based on the laws of your country, based on the decisions of independent bodies? CARICOM had to make that decision. And I think somewhere along the way, persons made decisions that represent the reason why CARICOM fails. Selfish, insular decisions that, look, what side will I fall on? And when I fall on this side, what does it mean for me? People made those decisions, it's obvious. One would be naive. And in that kind of scenario and context, I believe the decisions that were made had those kinds of dynamics that surrounded what occurred and what unfolded. I mean, I read the CARICOM report. When there was the national recounting, I read the CARICOM report, and as a man of letters, somebody who reads these documents, I was once functioning at the highest level of government, and you read documents and you develop the art of seeing when somebody is committing what we call a stately hatchet job. It's like a hatchet job, and you read the language. And when you see all these caveats, when you see all these cautionary language, whenever you see these adjectives, I mean, Dr. Hines and Mr. Jordan, you men are versed in these things. You know, when, as in Guyana, they would say a set work. You know, you're embarking on a set work, and you see the fancy language, but reasonably credited. You know what's at play. And as you read the language, you realize this is not what you call straight up structured language based in fact. This is language design, and it was shameful because if you take that document, you carry it to any forum for scrutiny, and you look at the language, the kind of caveats and nuances being used. I mean, having been trained in history and having been trained when you got to write speeches and you have to write political speeches and you want to communicate something with a certain strategic a focus, you start looking for, you start looking to throw anything on the wall. You're looking for anything to squeeze out something, so you find all of these caveats. That's when I read the report. I said to my friend, I called my friend, I said, this is shameful business. So to answer your question, one, I think we have to accept that once anything occurs here, it is no longer a quiet event. I am saying to people, I've discussed with my friends, back in the days, elections within political parties may have been something nobody cares about. Not today in Guyana. If there's an election of political party, it's being discussed in Brussels. It's being discussed in Washington, because the game has changed for us. I think too often we fail to recognize what we have lying 120 kilometers off the shore. I mean, we talk about it, but do we really reflect on how we can affect global security? And if that gets into jeopardy, what it means for global politics and the power play between Russia and China, we're involved in big, serious business. And once we accept that, then it's easy for us to see that once you had an election of that magnitude, with all of those issues colliding, the powerful interest would have determined this is what we expect to see. And I can't see. It would be naive to think that those kinds of wishes were not communicated at some point to the leaders within CARICOM. In terms of what they did with that communication, I have no clear evidence, but it would be naive to think that it did not factor into their decision making.
Winston, you said at the beginning that your government didn't read the tea leaves. At what point you all began to smell the tea leaves?
I was just essaying with hindsight. Pun intended. Because when you look carefully, again, as I said, any government with a razor-thin majority, as we had to perform in a manner that would have been, let us just use the word, superior to how we ended up, so to speak. Certainly not in the carefree manner in which we took these things for granted. I mean, it is not to say that we didn't do some of the right things. Don't forget, prior to the elections, Mia Motley visited Guyana. And she was invested with, I think, the second highest national honor, and the flowery speeches and so forth. So it is not to say that we didn't make the right coatings and so on. Frandel Stewart visited Guyana before his elections, I think, and again he was invested, I think, either with a CCH or 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 whatever. And
he got the highest. He got the highest.
No, I don't think he got. No, we didn't give the OE.
Okay.
I don't think we gave him.
Well, it might have been the second highest, yeah.
But might have gotten the OR too.
Yeah.
So it's not that we didn't. But beyond those two prime ministers coming from the same place, so to speak, I don't know whether we did the right diplomatic and other moves in relation to CARICOM, in relation to cementing our place in CARICOM, per se, because we were coming back after 23 years of being out of power. And there were new actors, so to speak. And the people that the then PNC had cultivated, I talked about the Barrows and the Williamses and so on, they were all gone. They were all gone. And as you know, prime ministers don't speak to opposition leaders, or if they do, it's a rare event. There aren't too many opportunities for prime ministers to meet opposition leaders of other countries, right? So your intimate knowledge of prime ministers and so on and so forth would not have been there. You were out of power 23 years. You come in after 23 years and you meet a new set of people.
Yeah.
Many of them not even not near to your age. So the collegial part that sets the ball rolling and so on were not there. You didn't go to school in London, you know, or even UWE. You didn't go to school, you know, or whatever grammar school in England, and you know those collegial things weren't there, so to speak. You came and you met a different environment, right? An environment, as I said, where people had lost within that 20 years. The territories had lost the banana agreement with Europe. They lost the sugar agreement, and so on. Tourism was done but not out, and so forth. So people were in different mode that you left them 23 years ago. So when I say that we didn't take all of those factors into account, you know, as a government with a razor-thin majority, and be able to re-engineer our diplomatic front. You know, I mean, we had almost zero influence in Africa, whereas before 1992, I mean, Guyana had significant interest in Africa. And as a government coming in 2015, if you needed support, you know, as a so-called black government, you had to reconnect very quickly with Africa.
Yeah.
You didn't do that.
Yeah.
One person coming, Ghana coming here long after we were in power, and only after the chief met the man in Cuba. You see?
Yeah.
So those collegial and other foundation building stones, as I keep saying, in a razor-thin majority government, they weren't there. They weren't done, so to speak. So when we were looking for help in the country terms that happened post-March the 2nd or whatever was the elections, we couldn't reach out to anybody. They didn't know us. I mean, Africa didn't know us. You know? Bishop Tutu didn't know you. Liberian ex-president didn't know you.
Yeah.
So when you couldn't reach out to anybody. You couldn't reach out to anybody because they didn't know you. You didn't reach out to them. You didn't have friends. And when you were coming up with a powerful American government in the form of Trump government and so forth, even if perhaps you knew these people, you know, you weren't sure of their reactions to you, but at least you could have reached out to them. But you had no one. You were left alone in the cold. There's no one you could have reached out to. And that was a significant negative where we were concerned. And that is why I'm saying with foresight and not necessarily hindsight, we should have understood what a razor-thin majority meant, how we needed to shore up that majority, whether on the domestic front and on the international front. But unfortunately, I'm not telling any tales out of school. I'm just doing the analysis. We just did not do that, and it came back to haunt us in the post-elections environment. You know, that's not even bringing issues like the PR and so forth. You know, but I totally agree with what Ronald had said. I think he expounded on a number of points that I had raised earlier on the show, and certainly on TV, that I don't think we understood that the world had evolved, long left us, and so forth, and that they are friends and they are friends, so to speak. As I keep saying, Rowley is a friend. I'm sure Rowley is a friend of Guyana. I'm sure he's a friend of Mr. Granger and so on and so forth. But Rowley has his own issues in Trinidad, and he has a similar type situation in Trinidad as here in Guyana. And observing what is going on in Guyana, he has to know how to table to do that. So he's not about to go out on any limb. He's not about to go out on any limb, certainly not publicly. You know, to support you or to show any inclination that he's siding with you or so on. And that is why all your CARICOM is there also. They allowed the chairman of CARICOM, didn't know where they were leaning. Here's Ronald was right in saying that they go through the regional organization. So that take off the hook all the others. And the chairman, unfortunately, we had certain people who were chairman at that time, and the chairman or chairperson became the all-powerful person altogether.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Ronald.
Right, and those are the exact sentiments which Mr. Jordan expressed. I was earlier alluding to. In my estimation, during the election, the kind of geopolitical vortex that the coalition government was caught in, based on my understanding of history and my reading of international events, I see this happen all the time. And in my estimation, the only recourse was for there to be the streets. Your grassroots supporters would have been your only shield in that kind of circumstance. Whether they're peacefully out there agitating, whether they're filling the streets in a very peaceful manner, exercising their right to freely protest. Normally, when countries are caught in that, what I would call a geopolitical vortex, their last resort is always your people on the ground. I mean, there is a present example here I wish to allude to. Elections just concluded in Peru, and a left candidate emerged, an almost Marxist candidate, Mr. Castillo, against Fujimori. And because Castillo is receiving excellent advice from the likes of Evo Morales and from the Venezuelans, what he did when the first count came out and said that he was leading by a razor thin of, I think, about 40,000 votes, he immediately called his supporters into the streets to peacefully agitate around the Elections Commission. He said to them, "We're not going home until these results are verified." And they're still there as I speak, and this is going on for weeks. But he recognized, obviously based on his excellent advice, that he could be in for the squeeze. And you can have, even though you have a different regime in place, remember the Americans look out for their interests, because this here is, Dr. Hines, you know the history, Mr. Jordan, of course, know Pinochet 2.0, not Pinochet, sorry, the guy that Pinochet deposed, Allende. This is Allende 2.0, because Castillo has been openly Marxist in his campaign. He used a pencil and he got to the people that are a retired school teacher of indigenous descent. And he won, democracy prevailed, and he won the elections through a people's vote, free and fair process. But when he moved to peacefully agitate within the streets, I suspect the powerful interests backed off, because they recognized that had they made any kind of move, it would have resulted in a massive upheaval. I'm saying all of that to say that what happened with the elections at that time, the geopolitical squeeze was on. I mean, you had Brazil jumping in. There weren't options left. You had the CARICOM jumping in. You had every single regional, any grouping issuing statements. So that's a squeeze. The only way you get out of that is if you have agitation on the ground. And that didn't occur. I'm just putting all of this into context to allude to the fact that in the context of us discussing CARICOM, it comes back to this, as Mr. Jordan rightly alluded to, the issues of Rowley. Rowley can probably have sentiments. He probably sees that, he does. Rowley he knows. While we're on the subject of Rowley, I paid close attention to Rowley after our elections. Rowley did a surprise call for elections and immediately started to strategically maneuver himself in a way in which he was not in for the squeeze, because he knew. Remember, he invited those officials from Venezuela to come to Trinidad. And you had the vice presidents and all of them on the plane, and Pompeo and the others paid attention. And Kamala tried to seize upon it. Rowley suspected that he would be in for the squeeze. So he called us quick elections, and he strategically maneuvered himself in a position where he could not be in a position where he would get squeezed. So my point is that while we discuss CARICOM and while we cast aspersions as CARICOM, that geopolitical pressure that was coming, I don't know any Caribbean leader who was willing for Guyana and for the government at the time and say, we're going to support you and put our necks on the line. I'm not sure anybody was prepared to do that with COVID-19, with the lockdown, with the economic fallout coming. Tourism already dried up. That's the mainstay of their economies. I don't know who was prepared at that time to be a revolutionary and say to the Trump administration, which, by the way, was an administration that wanted things done today without delay, without hesitation, and they were willing to put the squeeze, whether it is visa sanctions, whether it is going to the Treasury Department and freezing accounts, whether it's to mobilize the military. They were vicious. And anybody who had interactions, I had slight interactions with the embassy when I worked, and I knew you got the memo early that foreign policy was not being run from the State Department in the professional way it was run in the days of Obama and maybe Clinton. Foreign policy was being run from the White House. And even the representatives around the world, they got instructions directly from the White House, and all of these bureaucratic structures within the State Department were completely gone. So if the White House would have communicated to the State Department, this is what we expect to see. The State Department's job was not to go through all the bureaucratic considerations. The State Department's job was to use all of its systems to ensure that what was expressed in the White House was realized on the ground. So when one looks at all of those things in retrospect, I mean, we have to admit there was little chance for the coalition government unless the coalition government was willing and prepared to have their supporters on the ground peacefully agitate, and that would have created some kind of pushback. Once that decision was not made, the game was over.
And at times that is why, if you remember, if you watch the CAMS thing, you raised it earlier. I said, notwithstanding the pressures that were coming down externally, the onus was on the then government of Guyana to do what it had to do in conformity with Constitution and the law and get the things done. Because even, I mean, people complain that the president go and he sign a recount order and so on. All right? But when you look at the recount order that he signed in good faith, they got nobody in this country could tell you that the recount order was executed in good faith. And you saw the shifting of the sand very early.
Yeah.
You are telling me an experienced appeal court judge who drafted that order, and that order was reviewed by any number of senior counsels. This thing wasn't drafted by the Drake Yard man in the street. This was drafted by an appeal court judge of great standing. And in that order was a forensic audit. And when it came down to the count, the very judge said, hey, you know something? That thing said, I know it said, but you got to go to election petition. My friend, tell me in which country outside of Guyana, Guyana can't be a real place, that such a thing will go down as it went down.
Yeah.
And the narrative shifted from forensic audit to count the votes in the box.
In the box, yeah.
To such an extent that it doesn't matter how the votes went in there, because after all, you had 40 boxes plus with no paperwork. You had boxes that had votes that belonged to a different region, not even district, a different region altogether. But these were totally irrelevant. It said count the votes. Yeah. So it's not all I'm saying. Look, you can mash CARICOM, rightly if you want. You could mash the European Union. You could mash all these different people. But for me, the end of the day is the government of the day that count, and their actions consistent with the Constitution and the law that are more important. And I'm saying, if you absorbing those actions, you're absorbing your Constitution and your laws and everything else. Yes, international pressure may have some still have some sway. But I'm saying to you, once you put it out there, and that is where your friends were missing. Because the narrative that was being put out there was that you trying to cheat.
Yeah.
You trying to cheat. And the narrative that has persisted over a year already is that you trying to cheat. And the narrative was set up, as you have said a number of occasions before, that PNC got a history of rigging. And therefore, if I lose, I can say the election's rigged and I can behave bad. Which is what was put out there. And as I said, BPR was not very good. It didn't negate that narrative. But we did not put enough pressure to ensure that all four aspects of the recount order were fully implemented. And I believe President Guaita would have been within his rights to say that he signed on to what he believed was a legal instrument that had four parts. And that unless all four parts were executed in good faith, he had a right to say that the elections weren't
right. Thank you, Winston Jordan and young Ronald Austin, really turning it up here tonight. Some very important points you made. Winston, I want to take you back to 1965, shortly after the PNCUF government came to power. And Mr. Burnham asked then Sidney King to go as Guyana representative to the United Nations. Sidney King told him, I'm not a diplomat, but here's what I can do to you. You're not known across Africa. I am volunteering to go to Africa for you. And he went and visited 13 countries in Africa and introduced Burnham and the PNC to the Africans. The Africans had known Jagan as an anti-imperialist voice. They didn't know Burnham well. And Sidney King went there, and that was the basis of the later wonderful relations that the PNC had. In a sense, making friends, as you were saying. You come into power, people don't know you, you don't know them. They had known Guyana, and Guyana said, I think I'm the best man. And he went to 13 countries and said, look, Burnham and the PNC are as progressive as the PPP anymore. The rest is history. Young Austin, during the crisis.
Look, David, don't go after the point. Let me give you a quick thing before you go to Ronald.
Yeah.
What you were speaking about confirms what I'm saying. In 2016, myself, Raphael Trotman, and some people from Commonwealth Secretariat, I think it was, went to Zambia. No, I went to Zambia in 2016 as part of a World Bank debt management. They were using some skills to help out with the conference. And during that meeting, the Zambian minister who came to open it, I was recognized because I was one of the few ministers who was there. I was introduced to him, and I made mention of the fact of Guyana helping out Zambia back in the 70s, the early 70s, that we sent, stenographers and all these different people when Zambia was under stress from South Africa. A lot of people who were being there and so on. And he professed that he didn't remember that period, right? But then he came back to me the next day, and he said he spoke to his foreign minister, who remembered the help that Guyana, and he wanted to see me. And I spoke with the foreign minister, and he wanted us to meet our president and to re-establish that. A few months after, I went with Trotman to Uganda to look at their oil sector, because they were at the same stage we were at, emerging oil producers and so. And again, I met officials there who expressed high interest in re-establishing contacts with Guyana, right? Because in these parts, they didn't have too much of a familiarity in terms of representation. I'm just putting that out there in the context of the Guyana thing and so on to show that, and I'm sure Grenade, who was the foreign minister then, would have met any number of people in all his different meetings that he went to, who would have expressed that fraternal brotherhood, greetings, so on, reestablishing their contacts in the Caribbean and so on. Because I can tell you, in that 23 years of the PPP government, those contacts weren't cemented.
That's right.
You understand? So we had to have a foreign policy, you understand, that suggested that we were not only in the business of being part of the Committee of Nations, but that we were going to bring something, going to get something, you know, we were going to get something from it, whether it's brotherhood, whether it's unity, whether it's trade, whether it's opening new business links, cultural contacts, and so on. You know, nobody says anything when government move to India to enhance cultural contacts and so forth. Nobody says anything when we try to enhance cultural and other contacts with China. But yet we seem not to want to do that when it comes to,
right.
You know?
Right.
And again, I said, we had no friends. We had no friends to turn to. We had no friends to say to them, listen, we agreed on a recount order that said the votes had to be audited forensically. But they want all other three parts done, but not this part. And my friend Ronald talked about the CARICOM report. Now I have to laugh if you listen to the CAMS TV. I had a thing what I said about it. But in addition to jumping to hoops and all this kind of thing they tried to jump to, they said that they weren't there to do an audit. They were there to count votes. That was the same thing Cross said. Cross didn't do any forensic audit. Cross counted votes. He didn't do any forensic audit. And in many respects, the forensic audit was done for these people, because the evidence from the board and the deeds registry came through. The evidence from the chief immigration officer came through, suggesting a whole set of votes were damaged votes, if you want to call it that. Because if you want to count votes in the, you don't need CARICOM, you don't need CRAS, you don't need EU, you don't need anybody. All you do is when you open the box, you count the votes. Story finished. And that is exactly what the people did. That's exactly what they did. They counted votes. And when the CCJ say a valid vote is a vote that is not spoiled or do something, then, you know. So that's my point is exactly what you have enhanced on, and what Ronald has enhanced on, is that while friends are important and so forth, friends can't substitute for the actions that you as a national government are supposed to take. In furtherance of your interests in the protection of the Constitution, your constitutional mandate, and the safety of your citizens. So I'm not want to say it's a cop-out to blame CARICOM and to blame America and all this kind of thing. But I will continue to maintain, for me, while they were a problem, their bigger problem was local.
It was local. And it makes the point that foreign policy is important, the synchronizing of foreign policy with domestic policy. During the Grenada crisis in 1983, at a different time, as Winston Jordan mentioned, at that time they were, even when the Americans were coming to invade, there were prime ministers who were prepared to say, we don't agree. Burnham said, I didn't agree. Ling said, I didn't agree. George Chambers in Trinidad said we didn't agree. In fact, Barnum leaked the Canadians. The point was a different time. Then you had leaders who were prepared to stand up for the mighty America and the English. So in these times, we don't have the leaders with that kind of outlook on the world. And I think, Winston, you're right. We should have known that. And we should have connected. We should have sent people who understand those people, know them. The thing, you see, back in the old days, I remember interviewing Eugenia Childs. She said, I know when Burnham turned a communist. They lived in the same university hall. And a communist party man used to come every Sunday. He came to me and I chased him away. And he went to Odo's room and Odo began to talk to him. These people knew each other. They live in the same hall in England. With Burnham, he said, and when he come with his moth suit, the text, he said, Odo, it's me, you know. We went to school together. Before those people in Guyana, and making those points to say, those people of that generation, they knew each other. She, Barrow, and Burnham knew each other intimately. And it made for better foreign policy and relations and so on. Those times are gone. And as both of you are arguing, if you're running a government, you have to understand who your partners are. What is it that make them tick? So that when the time comes, you will know whether you can call on them or you can't call on them. Not one single one. Yes, go ahead.
Right, and it's important that a point missed me earlier.
Yes.
There's something called strategic decision making, which Mr. Jordan is consistently alluding to. Any government that is strategically thinking, once you accede to government with a one-seat majority, you're supposed to assemble a team of strategic thinkers, a committee as it were, who will examine, this is from day one, you know, examine the possibilities of what shortfalls could meet you with this one-seat majority. This is a committee of people who will be committed to advising the highest political decision makers on the scenarios that could emerge with a one-seat majority. That should have happened on day one. That didn't occur. So Mr. Jordan is correct. Or most of these things could be, these things that would have happened are nothing strange, you know. They're not alien, they've happened in history. We replete with these examples. They happen every day. It's basic. But what I need to mention is that when we're having these discussions, we have to mention all the facts. And regardless of what Pompeo did and what the other persons would have did to protect their interests, I must say it was made pretty easy for them with what occurred and what has been labeled as the Mingo fiasco. Once that would have occurred at the command center, that essentially was the PR riches right there, and you took that and you spin it all around, even though it was something that was supposed to be resolved by the commission, because those things occur in countries around the world, and an independent commission would collect that report and on the spot examine it. We never got to that stage. But my point is, yes, what occurred at Mingo, where you had a lot of question marks and the kind of institutional maneuvers that began to manifest because of what happened with the command center. I mean, people need to be honest. At the level of the Commonwealth Council of Ministers met to discuss Guyana and the Region 4 declaration. Once you see those kinds of maneuvers happening, you're talking about serious maneuvers that if you disregard, you basically have to become a pariah. You'll be squeezed and you have to find out how you're surviving. So my point is, whatever geopolitical maneuvers were made against the government, what occurred at the command center with the Region 4 declaration, you can argue it was nothing, you can argue that it was serious, whatever position you take on it, it is that occurrence and taken to whatever propagandistic level it was taken to. That is what Pompeo and others had. They kept on their side. They had they considered to be the PR initiative. And I'm of the view paying attention to these matters, that once you had a recount order, I told a friend who he and I discussed these affairs all the time in confidence. I said to him, and I have the email, I'll keep it for posterity. I emailed him, I said, once part 1 of the recount order is complete, that is it. And I told him, I said, we're not going to get into 2, 3, and 4. He said to me, oh, you mean it's a legal instrument, it's a document, we signed it, they can't do that. I said, you watch. And immediately once part 1 was finished, that was it. And all the pressures came after that. So I knew that persons who are making these decisions are probably institutionalists and constitutionalists and believe that the world would function in a rational way. The Trump-Pompeo foreign policy operation did not have any regards for laws and constitutions. And as much as we like to think we're important, Guyana, in their estimation, is not a country of that level of consequence where they're afraid to do some bulldozing and bullying. They know that, they probably think that, look, we're going to do some bullying here, and who's going to come to their defense? So I think we need to understand that that kind of thing with law and order and structure, that was not what characterized the Trump administration. The Trump administration had foreign policy objectives, and they were willing to carry a sledgehammer and an axe to anybody who was in defiance. I mean, we can look at examples. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, came to this, had a meeting at Trump Mar-a-Lago estate and invited a selected few of CARICOM leaders. Some, I think, Prime Minister Motley refused to go and others refused and so on. But I'm just saying that kind of action showed you it was gangsterism. This is what we want. So once we would have found ourselves, once the government at that time would have found itself up against that kind of beast, all of this thing about order and step 1 and step 2 and the Constitution, these people were not. It basically came down to this. What do you have? Where is your power? We are going to pursue our interests with the sledgehammer. What are you going to do? Where's your power? And in those circumstances, the only power you have is peaceful agitation within the streets. That's all the power you have when you're facing that kind of thing. And the only way people would start to step back is if they believe that, look, you're willing to agitate to the point where you're going to put up some resistance and create a real global controversy or upheaval. So all of the talk about structures and step 1 and step 2, those people knew that the minute you finish count, it is over. And that was their intention from the inception, in my estimation. So I think we have to understand in these affairs, you have to read who you're dealing with. And once you read who you're dealing with, you come to conclusions. Your conclusions are supposed to influence your actions. And at some point, somebody with some kind of influence should have said, look, you're dealing with gangsters. You're not dealing with constitutionalists. You're not dealing with people who would have some concerns. I mean, if you look at the Biden administration, I mean, I'm not going to swear for any American administration. America pursues its interests. You have different custodians, but America pursues its interests. However, there's a little chance you might have somebody in the seat who has a little regard for rules. And I think you compare Biden to Trump, or you compare Obama to Trump, you might have a professional State Department with bureaucrats who might say, we can't do this, it's going to look bad, and so on. But during the Trump administration, you did not have that. You had the foreign policy be driven from the White House, and you were dealing with gangsters. And all of this talk about constitution and law, it didn't fly with them.
Well, here we have it tonight. Quite a lot of food for thought. It's I think tonight's program really shed some new perspective on how to evaluate what went down last year. Young Austin, you're getting some plaudits. Lawrence, who knows something about what we're talking about, says important points discussed in Big Power Bullyism. Welcome to your first edition of Politics 101. They're tough here. Know them because often I think what has happened in the last Guyanese, both at home and abroad, have become so much more knowledgeable about their civic. It's some of these issues that we would have been more complex issues. They're now sifting them out, largely because on any given night, they can come onto one of these platforms and have this kind of discussion. And it makes for better conversation when your audience really is in sync with what's happening. We're about program time. Let me give you all your closing statements. Answer this question: what happens now with Guyana and CARICOM? Winston, you go first.
Thank you. Quite interesting. The last hour and a half or day about. Yes, I am happy that you posed this question towards the end here and give me a chance to wrap up. In the context of the government, because I separate between government and the opposition. In the context of the government, I believe the Ali administration has already flexed its muscle in relation to the road matter, and they are. I think what he's saying is that, look, we will make all the right noise about CARICOM integration and so on, but we're not going to brook any interference or any such or any criticism of our government. Therefore, this whole noise that surrounds democracy and so on, that has been left at the table of the last elections. I don't think you will see CARICOM making any statement, any noise or intervening in relation to any of the number of quote-unquote transgressions that have taken place over the last 10 or 11 months, so to speak. They are going to say, well, it's not our business. And we believe in this business of not interfering in the affairs of state. So all of that is going to be watched under that rubric of not interfering in the affairs of state. So apparently, democracy only means counting votes in ballot boxes. The opposition is going to learn the hard way that it has virtually no friends in CARICOM. And so it is back to where I said it should have been all the time, which is at home. It is at home where all the action has to take place. And if that action, or if those actions rise to a level that ultimately attract the attention of the regional and international community, I think then some weight of the opposition can be exerted. One only has to look, for example, at Desmond Hyde. Desmond Hyde didn't look originally for CARICOM intervention. In fact, CARICOM asked Desmond about intervention after they saw what was happening at the time. And CARICOM maintaining interest in Guyana was only after Hyde proved a very difficult customer to deal with, that the government had to deal with. But CARICOM is not going to enter under the circumstances that we have now unless dramatic things happen. And even where dramatic things happen, I think they're going to wash their hands because, like I said, now you see, Guyana used to be known as the sick man of the Caribbean. You know that.
Yeah.
Guyana was accused of panhandling. Guyana's then president was accused of panhandling by the then Prime Minister of Jamaica.
Yes.
But all of that is changing before their very eyes. All of that is changing before their very eyes.
Yes.
Especially during and coming out of COVID, where resources are virtually non-existent. Guyana is the lifeline that they will all be hoping to pull on. And so they will do. The Ali government hasn't finished 1 year yet. We've got 4 more to go. So in that context, they're not about to, intervene in Guyana unless it's a dramatic circumstance. And even then, they may shield themselves under the clothes or the cloak of the wider international community. So the opposition has to understand that, and their strategic move is at home, first and foremost. Most of their efforts has to be concentrated at home, and the report works and so forth can do the international driving that will bring the kind of attention and focus to Guyana and translate words into action. Otherwise, we're in for very, 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 very long and painful haul in Guyana.
Long and painful haul in Guyana. Mr. Austin, your closing answer to that question?
Right. And where do we go here with CARICOM? For Guyana, I think it's important, I wish to say that Guyana we must not get excited. We are a nation with a border dispute. Let us not forget. I know we've discovered oil, and there's talk of us being the next Dubai. And maybe at some point we're becoming complacent and probably think that we could adopt the same attitudes which have been traditionally adopted by our rich cousins like Trinidad, Barbados, Bahamas, and Jamaica. We are a nation of economic migrants. We must not forget that. We have almost a large diaspora, almost touching, some people say 800,000 outside of Guyana. All of them were once, at some point, economic migrants trying to eke out their existence. So Guyana must not forget. Do not get excited with this oil. As you know, oil is not a guarantee that you're going to become some superpower and you're not going to need anybody. CARICOM is needed. If Venezuela loves when we're at war, we are around with CARICOM, so she moves in and she keeps her solidarity and her friendships. When we're going to have policies that are inimical to groups such as the Haitians, and I've argued in a column this week that in the Caribbean context, the Haitians are essentially like our Palestinians. They are poor, no fault of their own. Anybody who knows the history know that $21 billion had to be paid back to France after the revolution when Haiti got her independence in 1804. The country was deliberately impoverished, and that is why Caribbean nations understand that you have a bit more tolerance when it comes to Haiti, because they are hardworking and extremely proud people, but they're in poverty, if you look at the history, no fault of their own. So I'm saying to Guyana, you need CARICOM. I want to see CARICOM survive. Let us not get excited. Let us ensure that we keep our friendships. This is both in the opposition orbits and in the government orbits. We have a border dispute, and we must never forget that. We tend to bounce around and enjoy ourselves until Venezuela starts to make a move, and then suddenly we clamor for friends. Is that context and having regard and consideration for that, I believe Guyana needs to ensure that it keeps its relations with CARICOM. Conversely, we must demand, and when we talk about CARICOM, we often talk about CARICOM at a governmental level and government to government. We must not forget, if there's an opposition party that has grouses with CARICOM, you have civil society and opposition groups within CARICOM who you can agitate with. You may have an issue with the regional body, but you have issues with the regional body, but you're also advocating within CARICOM with those persons, and in that way you do what you call a kind of opposition regional integration in that regard. So we must not have a one-dimensional outlook. We need CARICOM. We need to remember we're a nation with a border dispute. We also need to remember we're a nation of economic migrants. And in that regard, I think Guyana should really be careful with how we proceed with CARICOM.
And there you have it, young Ronald Austin. The audience is saying that you must come back. Certainly, audience, he will come back. Yes, I know you all miss Amanza. Amanza, please get well. They're saying that they miss you, but Mr. Austin certainly has filled in for both you and himself. Winston Jordan, as usual, thanks for bringing that other kind of perspective on the program. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming on.
Thank you,
And
Dr.
there we have it. CARICOM dynamics after the 2020 election. Quite a discussion tonight. And I'm sure that we would have brought new perspectives, new information, new more kind of education, popular education for audience. You, of course, have been a wonderful audience. Please, we need to stay. We're on broadcast TV in Guyana, and we want to stay on broadcast TV in Guyana. We want you to help us stay on broadcast TV. We're looking for at a minimum 15 pledges of donations from you. When I'm finished here, they will play an advertisement to tell you how to do that. We're looking for 15 pledges so that we can stay on air here and on broadcast TV in Guyana. Donate what you can donate. It doesn't matter. We need a minimum of 15 pledges. Until Thursday, ancestral lands. This is becoming a big issue now. It's the PPP sending the Ministry of Agriculture into communities and trying to break up cooperatives, trying to form their own groups, and trying to get hold of ancestral lands, get hold of projects that were started by the last government and putting their people in charge of those projects. The question of ancestral lands has risen its head again. We're going to talk about it on Thursday. I think we're having on Dr. Simpson De Silva. Some of you may know him as a former Minister of Agriculture. He's big into that. Jonathan Adams, we hope to get on. And Lincoln Lewis, as you know, he has been in the forefront of fighting to keep ancestral lands in the hands of African Guyanese. That will be our discussion on Thursday as we continue on Politics 101 to break new ground and to bring new voices to you, to bring new perspectives. And you know what? They're noticing the difference we are making on these platforms, whether it's Mark Benskop or Sherrod Duncan or Cam Steve in the mornings, Randolph Critchlow, Branford Burke, Rickford Burke, you know the platforms. We are making them nervous because we are doing what they've blocked us from doing on the formal networks, and we're using these networks to carry the fight to them, So please help us to stay put so that we continue to make our contributions. This is David Einstein. Thank you for staying with me for another edition of Politics 101, and see you on Thursday.
Please help keep Politics 101 on social media and broadcast television. If you are in North America, please donate via Cash App or PayPal.
If you are in Guyana and the Caribbean and don't have access to Cash App and PayPal, email your pledge to dhines6106@aol.com and we will direct you how to get your donation to us. Thank you in advance for your donation.